Welcome back to the fourth day of a week-long conference, the fifth annual Hemispheric Security Conference, held here virtually at Florida International University. My name is Frank Moore. I'm the director of the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center here at FIU. Welcome back to those of you who have participated in previous panels, and welcome to those who are just joining us to listen in to what will probably be a very interesting and insightful conversation about Venezuela, the humanitarian and the political crisis in Venezuela. So why don't we just jump right in and to give a lot of time for your Q&A. There's a box there for you to answer your question, to ask your questions in the Q&A box during the course of this session. It is, of course, a distinct honor for me to introduce my partner in crime, my good friend and colleague here at FIU, Brian Fonseca, who is the director of the Gordon Institute for Public Policy. You would see a lot of his recent work on Venezuela, by the way, very interesting stuff regarding China and Russia. I highly recommend that work. And he will be introducing a stellar panel to have a broad discussion about what's going on in Venezuela. So Brian, I turn the mic over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mora. Before I jump into our session, I just want to thank you for your leadership and your mentorship over the years. This has been a fantastic partnership between our organizations, a fantastic relationship and mentorship that you provided me. And so certainly grateful. Thank you. All right. Well, listen, we have an exciting lineup set to go into depth on the humanitarian crisis and the challenges associated with restoring democracy in Venezuela. So let me very briefly introduce our panel. It's a panel that needs very little introduction, but I want to do some service and just kind of highlighting a few things, and then we'll jump right into Q&A. And so first, joining us from Caracas, Mr. Anatole Carmen, who reports on Venezuela and neighboring countries for the New York Times. Of course, he focuses on economics and politics of Chavismo, and he's covered Latin America for more than a decade, including 6 years on the ground in Venezuela. So welcome, Anatoly. We have a good friend, also an intellectual mentor, Dr. Cindy Arnson, who's director of the Latin America program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Dr. Laura Gamboa, an assistant professor at Utah State University, whose research focuses on institutions, regime, and regime change in Latin America. Laura, thanks for joining us. And then last, but certainly not least, Dr. Harold Trinkunas, who's currently deputy director and senior research scholar at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. And so Dr. Trinkunas, thanks for joining us. All right, so let me jump right in. Here's the plan. I'm gonna toss some broad questions out to each of our speakers, ask them to provide just a few minutes of remarks to kind of get the conversation started. And then I'll try to drive a conversation for about 30 minutes and then reserve the last half of the session to take what I expect to be a lot of questions from the audience. And so let's get started. And first, so I'm going to start with you, Anatoly. You're on the ground. And so if you can share some of your observations with us on the ongoing humanitarian crisis, what are some of the things that you've observed, particularly over the last year or so, that have been changing? And certainly talk maybe perhaps about how the impact of COVID may be exacerbating an already incredibly dire situation for the Venezuelan people.
Thank you, Brian. The situation in Venezuela is quite critical. I think on top of the direct impact of the pandemic and the global economic slowdown we've seen across the world, particularly in the developing world, you have a very toxic combination of factors that was already present, the political paralysis, the already very weak economic situation that was present before, the international isolation of a country, and the crippling gasoline shortages that more or less coincided with the arrival of the pandemic in the country. So the situation is very bad from a humanitarian perspective, very volatile, and the country is at a standstill. Gasoline shortages in particular have been extremely severe and basically put the whole country to a standstill. It's very difficult to move around the country, to move goods between between different cities, even for ambulances, for doctors to get any fuel to do their job. And it's very hard to see how it's going to be solved. But I think that's the main issue affecting Venezuelans at the moment. Even on the black market, it's very difficult to get gasoline. You have to you get a few gallons here and there, even if you have access to dollars. So this is something that's very difficult to solve, even if you have access to foreign currency. On top of that, you have, of course, the political crisis, which doesn't look like there's going to be any breakthrough in negotiations in terms of transition. The recent failed raid on Venezuela, so to speak, has only exasperated that. And we're just beginning to see in the last few weeks the pandemic perhaps really hitting the country. The government here has been able to minimize the impact of COVID in the first few months. A combination of factors, limited mobility, very few international flights, again, lack of gasoline that I already mentioned, have kept cases quite low for the last few months. But we are beginning to see a very significant rise. We're talking about 100 cases per day, and this is in the context of very limited testing capacity. So the Venezuelan government, they only can process, better said, about 150 cases per day. So we really have no idea what's going on. But just from that very small official sample, we are beginning to see a very major rise. And this is after 2 months of a lockdown. So this, the government is not able anymore to keep the country under lock. People need to get out of their homes to make a living, for food, to try to earn some money. Although the lockdown is still in effect, the streets of Caracas are full, the shops are open. There's buses, roads are packed because there's no really cushion for people to rely on. So you have a crumbling. Lockdown regime in combination with exponentially rising number of cases and very limited economic ability for the governments either to ameliorate the impacts of the pandemic or to bring in international aid to help it. So very toxic events, and the next few weeks are going to be quite crucial.
Thank you. And if not the next several months, as we continue to see, the effects of COVID-19 continue to wreak havoc throughout the region, throughout the hemisphere. In fact, we'll certainly start to assess that further, and we'll get into that a little bit more. I want to turn to Cindy for a moment. Cindy, you've been very vocal about U.S. policy. I've heard several of your statements and some of your testimonies before the U.S. Congress. Can you talk a little bit about what you think the U.S. should be doing, or what the U.S. could do to help better aid the people of Venezuela, and drawing that really important distinction between the people of Venezuela and the Venezuelan government?
Sure, Brian, thanks so much for the question. Thanks to you and to Frank Mora for this invitation to participate in this great conference. Let me just start out by saying, trying to draw some conclusions about who was responsible for the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, and then what the United States government and other international actors should do to ameliorate the humanitarian crisis. And let me just start by saying that the depth of the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela is squarely the responsibility of the government. Since Nicolas Maduro took power in 2013, the economy has declined by 2/3. I mean, that's just a calamitous collapse. The IMF, even before oil prices tanked, was saying that the Venezuelan economy was going to go down by another 10%, probably much more than that, given the collapse of oil prices and the impact of COVID-19. And there were, there was a litany of international organizations and Venezuelan organizations which were chronicling the chronic food shortages, the lack of medicine, the fact that hospitals don't have running water or electricity. And so the responsibility for this, Maduro likes to place at the feet of US sanctions. And US sanctions, I think, have definitely had an impact, particularly on the gasoline shortages that Anatoly was describing. And that is a key aspect of responding to the humanitarian crisis. So the question is, really what should be done? And I would say that channeling assistance through United Nations agencies, which dragged their feet, I have to say, for several years in putting in place an aggressive program to respond to the crisis, now doubled the number of people that it has on the ground. In 2019, there are over 500 people representing a broad array of UN agencies, including UNICEF and the UNHCR and PAHO, Pan American Health Organization, which of course is the regional affiliate of the World Health Organization, which has come into the crosshairs of the Trump administration. And they have to work because Venezuela is a member of the United Nations system. They work with ministries such as the health ministry and the education ministry, but not only with governmental entities. They work with the opposition. They work with international humanitarian organizations, domestic humanitarian organizations. And I think they are, really a key player. They distribute aid not on the basis of what the government says, we want you to do X, Y, Z, but based on their own needs assessment, which is conducted every year by the humanitarian relief organization OCHA. So, another of the problems that groups, the independent humanitarian organizations face is that the Venezuelan government won't recognize their status as national organizations to work inside the country. But there are now 14 organizations that do have that recognition. They include Caritas, they include the Norwegian Refugee Council, the Red Cross, and these are, I think, the organizations that are best positioned to help get humanitarian aid throughout the country, not just in Caracas, but outside of Caracas. And of course, there's a question of shortages of supplies and funding, but there's also a question of the shortage of fuel to be able to deliver this. So I guess just a final comment on the impact of the sanctions. The State Department, emphasizes over and over again, and they're quite right, that the U.S. sanctions imposed by OFAC, the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, have an exemption for humanitarian aid. So that is true in theory, but in practice, it has become very bureaucratic, very difficult for organizations to navigate the sanctions and make sure that what they are doing is in compliance. For example, if an organization funds a Venezuelan NGO that has to pay light bills or water bills, which of course are in the hands of state entities, and therefore funding that may come from abroad is going to, benefit a Venezuelan state entity, does that mean that you can't fund, that Venezuelan NGO? So there are a lot of areas in which I think the Trump administration and OFAC need to be in direct dialogue, the State Department as well, direct dialogue with the humanitarian assistance community, of course, with USAID and others, to facilitate the greater distribution of humanitarian aid. And this will help not only the Venezuelan population, but also the countries surrounding Venezuela that have received over 5 million Venezuelan refugees in the last several years.
I think that's a great point, especially on when we talk about the Venezuelan people, we're not just sort of constrained to those residing in Venezuela, but certainly the millions that are now around the region in dire conditions as well. And I want to come back to that as we get into the Q&A a little later on about the impact that community is having on shaping the politics of the region, but also in the form of remittances that may be coming back into Venezuela, continuing to sort of support and bolster economic sort of survival in that case. Okay, thank you, Cindy. I want to jump over to Laura. for a few remarks on some of the barriers to the restoration of democracy and certainly, the democratic, sort of rebuilding of democratic institutions in the near, mid, and long terms. Laura, what do you think about sort of that challenge, or are there opportunities that we might see on the horizon in terms of the restoration of democracy?
So hi, Brian. Thank you for inviting me. That's a very complicated question, but I'll do my best to make it brief, and we can just extend certain points. I think there are roughly 3 barriers right now. The first one, obviously, is the government. There isn't the structure of costs and benefits is really unfavorable for transition. To put it bluntly, the government really has very, very little reasons to negotiate a transition to democracy right now because supported largely by the military, they are still getting a couple of things out of being in government. The first one is access to lucrative businesses, legal and illegal. And the second one, of course, is impunity. As long as they stay in government, they get to do what they're doing without being penalized for it. Now, at the same time, of course, staying in power is not costless, but the costs are not as big, right? So if in order to stay in power, they have to repress, which is costly, and they are being sanctioned, which is costly too. But those costs are minor compared to the costs of stepping down and facing international courts, human rights, losing their money, going to jail, all of these other things. Now, the structure of costs and benefits could change, but here goes the second barrier, which is the opposition. The opposition, the way it has worked so far, has not been helping to change that structure. And there are 2 reasons why. The first one is they need to be willing to negotiate. But right now, what you see in the opposition is a stalemate between different forces. And this is not rare. The Venezuelan opposition has had 2 factions, roughly, one more radical than the other one. But right now, like, the radical really does not want to negotiate. They don't want to give the government anything. They want to obliterate Chavismo, right? The moderate would be willing to negotiate, but they cannot do it without the radical one, because the radical one is gonna create obstacles to that. Now, and here goes the third obstacle: the international community could help both change that setting, but of course, we're facing a very particular type of international community. And what we had seen in the 1980s and 1990s is the United States and organizations led in part by the United States playing an important role in helping democracies, in helping regimes in Latin America democratize in 2 ways. One, by pressuring the government to step down the dictatorship, but 2, by working as midwives for the opposition. Divided oppositions are not new, they're everywhere. But they can foster that union. They could create spaces for the opposition to converge. Of course, that's not happening, because as long as the administration keeps up this idea that they may potentially, in some near future, invade Venezuela, the radicals really won't have any reason to converge with the moderates. So I think right now, those are the 3 main obstacles, barriers for any kind of transition to democracy.
I think that's a great point. And I think we're probably going to have to talk a lot more about the opposition. Certainly, if you're tracking on Twitter, why those sit down in conversation with Juan Orlando Hernandez on drug trafficking probably wasn't the smartest thing to do. And certainly you've seen, I think, both the moderates and the radicals within the opposition vie to try to control, or at least press Guaido to move in a particular direction. I remember around this time last year, Leopoldo Lopez standing off of Guaido's left shoulder in almost sort of a judo pose, as they were talking about retaking, Caracas. And so the fractures between the opposition, by the way, are not new, as you point out. They have been around, since the origins of Chavismo to begin with. And so we'll probably have to dig a little bit more into the opposition and talk about those strategies that could, as I think you make a great point, bring some of those different factions within the opposition together in an effort to truly strategically make transition or change over the mid to long terms. Let me pivot to Harold to bring it back sort of to US policy for a moment. And I had originally posed a question to Harold about what should the US or what could the US do to aid in the restoration of democracy in Venezuela. And the question evolved into not just what could or should the US do, but what could or should the US not do or shouldn't do, in that process. And so Harold, if you can jump in and talk a little bit about from the US perspective, the broader picture of the restoration of democracy, which I think is the long-term aim from a policy perspective.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Frank, for inviting me to participate in this fantastic panel. And I'm going to frame my remarks, I think, mostly in relation to the Venezuelan military, which I think is central to the transition and sort of what U.S. policy can do in relation to that. But I have to say, I completely concur with Cindy Arnson's points in terms of what the U.S. should be doing in terms of humanitarian assistance. I think those are excellent. And I concur with Laura on some of the obstacles to transition, among which I consider the military being one of these actors that's worried about accountability, benefiting from the current situation, and thinking about its own future. So I think there's a couple places where the US may have overplayed its hand in its current policies, and I'd identify two. One is the close proximity between the Guaido administration and the Trump administration, which I think plays into the narrative of the Maduro regime when it comes to painting the Guaido-led opposition as inauthentic and un-Venezuelan, particularly framing it for the military in this way. Of course, the recent Macuto adventure raid probably didn't help this. I think it only reinforces that frame that is portrayed by the Maduro regime that Venezuela is a victim of a vast right-wing conspiracy, and there's the evidence, right there on the beaches of Macuto. So this is something that I think helps them consolidate their link to the military. And this is important because the military needs to see a future for there to be a transition. They have to see what lies beyond the current cost-benefit structure and what that new cost-benefit structure that Professor Gamboa identified, right? What's that going to look like? What is their future? And I think that's one place where both the U.S. and the opposition have not done a very good job of identifying that. In fact, one of the things when we come back to talking about the opposition, I think the opposition really dramatically underused the powers that it did have, for example, to legislate, even if the legislation wouldn't become effective law, to paint a picture of what the future of Venezuela looks like, right? Who benefits, who, and how will some of these accountability issues be handled? The other place I think that we have to be concerned is the issue of sanctions. And this I paint not so much in relation to Venezuela, but in terms of broader US use of sanction policy. Sanctions are a very popular US instrument of foreign policy at this point. But we really are trying to impose sanctions on Venezuela in a way that is under the worst possible conditions. We know from other sanctions, from the study of sanctions, that really for sanctions to work, you need sort of three elements. One is near universal applicability. Everybody has to be on board for the sanctions. That doesn't exist in Venezuela. Secondly, we have to have that the thing you're asking the sanctioned target, in this case the Maduro regime, to give up is not that important, or that they don't expect it to be something they're going to fight about in the future. I think that's not the case here. Obviously, it's a very costly thing you're asking them to do. And third, you have to be able to credibly assure the target that if they stop doing the thing you want them to stop doing, that you'll stop sanctioning them. And if I was the Maduro regime, I wouldn't believe the US that sanctions will stop if they change their behavior. So I think on those three fronts, the sanctions are I think if you want the sanctions to be an instrument of getting to a more democratic Venezuela, they're not operating under the most favorable conditions right now. And I think I would also add to that they're helping to foster a sanctions evasion network connecting Venezuela, Iran, Cuba, Russia, China. And the more that the US does this, the more it creates incentives for these countries to route around US sanctions. So I think we need to place these things in the larger context of U.S. policy. That said, I do think that the U.S. should be encouraging, it should take some distance from the Guaido regime, let it stand on its own 2 feet, the Guaido presidency, but it also needs to encourage the opposition, as Professor Gamboa pointed out, to craft a set of policies that is more appealing, that crafts a narrative of what the future of Venezuela looks like, that is appealing to enough people that they'll support a transition.
Thank you. I heard Frank say, I think last year, he said sanctions for the U.S. is like Vicks Vapor Rub for Cuban abuelitas, right? You just kind of keep slapping it on and slapping it on. And the reality, as you point out, is that sanctions alone are not going to be effective in affecting serious change. And I think Cindy alluded to the fact that sanctions are having an effect, right? I mean, they are helping create conditions, but without the requisite exit ramp, without the requisite sort of provisions of change and sort of several other conditions that need to be brought into play, those sanctions are going to have limited utility in terms of affecting the true change that that many seek for Venezuela, which is the restoration of democracy and the removal of a regime that I think we all agree on is sort of the center of the the crisis, whether it's in terms of the humanitarian crisis or in terms of the shift to autocratic or authoritarian provision. So let me, Harold, I want to stay with you and pull Laura and others into the conversation on this, but you talk a lot about the military. And I think we can all agree, and by the way, I want to plug the work that you did on the Venezuelan military culture, work that you've done extensively, and Laura has produced some fascinating stuff on the Venezuelan military as well. And so when you talk about the military institution, arguably it is the key to continuity or change going forward, right? And so what types of factors could shape the military in taking a more active role in a transition? What are some of the things that would have to happen if the military was in fact going to step in and affect change?
So Brian, that is an excellent question. It might even be the I don't know, is it $100,000 question now or $500,000 question? I forget how the game show goes these days. But I think there has to be a structure of incentives for both the institution and for key individuals in the institution that they can envision a future in which they have they're not in power, they're not necessarily politically part of the regime, but they're still okay, right? That they would not be able to be prosecuted. They can, keep, what they've gained so far. We can be very critical about how they gained it. But ultimately, they have to see a future in which there's a role for the institution. And I think I would identify a couple key points. Probably one issue that's going to have to be handled is accountability. And it probably means some sort of transitional justice regime. We saw in the case of Colombia, as the civil conflict was being negotiated to an end, at least with the FARC, that the accountability and transitional justice issue was one of the most difficult ones to negotiate. So not to underestimate how difficult that's going to be. There's going to have to be some discussion. I think the opposition needs to lay out a much clearer view of how the institution will function. How autonomous is it going to be? How in control is it of its own fate? What do its budgets look like? What do you do with a severely overgrown general and admiral corps? How do you transform this into a more, you can offer a vision of a military that's more professional, that's more dedicated to military tasks, that has great career opportunities, but that all has an expense, right? It has an expense in terms of accountability, but also has an actual fiscal expense at a time when, of course, there's a massive economic decline in Venezuela, a global recession. This is a really hard one to square, but I think it really passes through some sort of narrative about the future of key individuals in the military and the senior high command, and the narrative of the institution. Because otherwise, some of the barriers that I'm sure Professor Gamboa will talk to, such as coup-proofing, internal surveillance of the military by Cuban-backed intelligence services or the Cuban intelligence services, ideologization, and others will really prevent the military moving in any kind of direction to support some kind of post-Maduro evolution.
Laura, did you have some thoughts you wanted to contribute as well?
Yeah, so I wanted to add that for that to happen, the agreement has to come organically. What we have seen is, so the State Department released these document like laying out how an agreement would work out, and like looking into the Colombian experience in particular, that won't work because the agreement has to come organically. It cannot come from the top down. So the step before that is to get the parties to the table, and once they're on the table, perhaps have a conversation about what is feasible. Because of course, what the military, and so I think the military wants institutional guarantees, but they also want some type of judicial guarantees. But of course, there is a political branch of Chavismo as well, and they will want political participation. And that's kind of the three things that I can see roughly. On the other hand, the opposition does not want to give them any of those, right? And some of them are really costly because, of course, when you're talking about some kind of transitional justice, that means that some of these people that have committed human rights atrocities or abuses are not going to face the judge that the opposition would want them to face, or they might keep the money they have stolen. And how you get, especially the radicals, but also the people behind them to support such an agreement is a big question. And my take is just, it cannot be imposed top down. It has to come from underneath. It has to come organically somehow.
I think it's a great point. And I've heard Harold say this on several occasions, and I think we've assessed it in some of the work that we've done together, is that we also have to underlie the fact that the military doesn't trust the opposition either. And so the provisions that the opposition is placing on the table isn't necessarily something that the military institution has a whole lot of faith in. We've heard amnesty thrown out several times, and I suspect many listening this morning and many in the opposition are incredibly hesitant on seeing high-level military officials get away with vast human rights violations or deep embeddedness in the illicit drug trafficking or illicit trafficking sphere. And you have historical cases. You take Argentina, for example, where amnesty was offered as an exit ramp, and that didn't necessarily turn out so well post 2003 when Kirchner came in. And those discussions have been brought up in places like Brazil and El Salvador, maybe not as serious as Argentina, but nonetheless, there's a precedence in which those provisions of amnesty, that exit ramp, wasn't necessarily offered in the long term. And so, maybe Harold or Laura or anyone want to take a shot at, and I know Cindy's got some stuff to say on this, so Cindy, let me come to you first. But talking about that role of the military and, again, that challenge between the opposition and the military institution. Cindy, you want to go first? And then I saw Harold and Laura, and we'll go in that order. And then I have some questions for Anatoly.
Sure. I guess I'm going to just place another level of complexity into the discussion, which is that any kind of transition scenario has to take into account the role of the military as an economic actor. I mean, currently they control key industries like the oil industry, ports, food distribution, any mining, and these are sources of income to the regime, but also sources of corruption. Not to mention, as Brian just did, the sort of swath of illegal economies from illicit gold mining to narco trafficking. And it's important to, Southcom's own maps indicate that there's far more drug flights leaving Colombia through Central America and on than there are leaving from Venezuela. So, the moniker narco state doesn't necessarily apply, but the notion of mafia state, I think, is one that really has to be grappled with. And these are not just, obviously there needs to be accountability for people that have tortured and killed and arrested, political opponents. those are the traditional issues of accountability, but how one changes the cost benefit analysis in a situation where the military is such a dominant economic actor, I think is really the tough nut that Venezuela poses, that's very different from other transitions in Latin America. Not to say there wasn't corruption within military governments in Brazil or Chile or Uruguay, Argentina, but this is at a scale that is just, I think, unforeseen in the hemisphere.
Excellent point. Harold, let me come to you.
Thanks, and I entirely agree with Dr. Arnson's point on the role, the economic role of the military in Venezuela. It's one of more barrier to envisioning some sort of transition. Paradoxically, a transition in Venezuela might lead to greater military autonomy as part of some sort of future structure, simply to as a bargain of sort of reducing political power in return for other institutional and economic guarantees. And we've certainly seen that in some of the other transitions. And I should be clear that none of this is sort of normatively desirable. None of us would like to see this as sort of an outcome in Venezuela. I think all of us are being very analytical on this panel about what we've seen in other cases and what might apply to the Venezuelan case. I think that here I'd like to come back to the point about, one place where the opposition did not do enough and has not done enough is use its control of the legislature to actually pass model legislation that could be a credible signal. I mean, passing legislation is very costly. Passing legislation on things like transitional justice, military reform, judicial reform would be costly. It would require a lot of bargains. It would require people in the opposition to stake out positions. But because of that, that actually might make it more credible. They took their political, blows to achieve this, and they laid out. So what does the military institution promotion and assignment system look like in the future? What does military education look like in the future of Venezuela? What does military justice look like in the future of Venezuela? And some of these things would have to be worked out through that. And that is, I think, an important signal to both the political and the military side of Chavismo about what the future of Venezuela looks like. And unfortunately, even though there was, as you say, Brian, some movement on things like amnesty, I don't think that's enough in this case. I mean, it's not just a question of, thank you, gentlemen. Okay, so most of you don't get prosecuted, but you can go home now. I don't think that really is a credible message to send an institution that, as both Dr. Arnson and Professor Gamboa have outlined, is so incredibly central for the support structure of the Maduro regime.
Excellent point. Laura.
So I wanted to add, on top of everything everybody has said, that so I think that the opposition, and I think this applies for the international, specific countries inside the international community as well, has a problem of audiences, right? So the problem is that the decisions are made for with future voters in mind, right? So the idea is, I don't want to pass legislation that would signal some kind of or pave the way for some kind of agreement, because my base will penalize me for that, right? And I think this is true for the international community as well, because of course sanctions, and you were talking about the Cuban abuelitas, and my thought is how sanctions are perceived in the US and Colombia, which are the two examples that I can see, and they're perceived as you're being tough with Venezuela. It doesn't matter that it doesn't work. It doesn't matter that it hurts more than it helps. But it's perceived as you're in tough. And so, for instance, and it helps electorally Trump in the US, but also say Iván Duque in Colombia. It's incredibly helpful. So I think the problem right now is that some kind of dialogue, some kind of signals for dialogue are not electorally beneficial for the different parties involved.
That's a great point. And Anatoly, let me follow up with you on some of the economic incentives in the military. Can you spend a few minutes talking about that?
Yeah, I think what Cynthia mentioned is very important. That we think of the military as an economic actor that's basically in charge of all the major sectors in the economy, and Maduro is very much aware of it. He's very much aware that he has to keep compensating the military economically to keep him on his side, and he was very smart about just as the economy collapsed, as the sort of the economic pie overall has shrank to give a larger role of it to the military, and a very great example of it was what we've seen last couple of months is the oil industry collapse and supply of gasoline collapse, which limited the amount of oil revenues and also revenues from gasoline smuggling to neighboring countries that military enjoyed. He gave them instead control of distribution of gasoline. So basically now, if you want to get any gasoline in the country, you have to buy it from a military on the black market. This is a major business. I mean, you're talking about a product that's given to you for free. Gasoline in Venezuela is still technically free, and then resold at very $15 a gallon. We're talking about profit margins of astronomical, close to infinity. So it's very hard to compete. It's very hard to explain to someone when you have such massive rents, seeking opportunities, that this is not in your interest, that you're better off doing something else. And that's kind of, I think, was one of the sort of political skills of Maduro, to always find a way to compensate the military economically, always finding new incentives to continue giving to them, to keep them on the side. And that's something I think that policymakers have to grapple with.
Thanks, Anatoly. And again, no doubt that the military plays a really important role in the future of Venezuela, and lots of really complex questions about how does that unfold and in what direction. We're getting about a question a minute right now between the audience here on Zoom and on Facebook. So I want to ask maybe two more sort of lines of inquiry, and then I'm going to go straight out to the audience. So I want to stay with Anatoly and Cindy, and I want to talk about the roles of China, Cuba, Russia, and of course, a lot of people talking now about Iranian tankers with gas on their way to Venezuela. And so some of these external actors have really played an important role in keeping the regime in business. While sanctions have been certainly squeezing the economic, sort of lifeline of the regime, these are some of the organizations that have been keeping the regime going through very difficult times. And so I want to get your thoughts. And by the way, I want to commend Cindy and the Wilson Center for a series that they've done and produced really rich work on the role of these actors. And so check out the Wilson Center's Latin America program for a series on sort of deep dives of these actors. But I want to hear your thoughts. And so Cindy, let's start with you. And then Anatoly, I'd like for you to add some thoughts. And if Harold or Laura want to jump in as well, by all means.
Sure, Brian, thanks. And thanks for your contribution on the Cuba-Venezuela paper to that series. I think the international dimension is absolutely critical. Internally, the role of the military, the role of a divided opposition, but also a very repressed opposition, are key factors, in terms of understanding the internal dynamics, but the external dynamics have also been absolutely essential. China has loaned something like $62 to $64 billion to Venezuela. It does not seem to be providing any new money. It constantly is relaxing the repayment terms because Venezuela just can't pay. Russia, for a long time, was the main marketer of Venezuelan oil after the imposition of U.S. sanctions on PDVSA. We've now seen that Rosneft has withdrawn, but there's another Russian state company that has stepped in. Still not clear where that's going to go in terms of the marketing of the limited Venezuelan oil that's coming out of the ground. Cuba has provided absolutely essential intelligence service. It's not just the number of Cuban military or intelligence people, but their role in training the DSEGIM, the internal intelligence apparatus, precisely to root out signs of rebellion within the armed forces. That's been critical. Turkey has played a very important role in the gold trade. And now there seems to be some more litigation about to take place with a British bank that is not a state entity that is being asked to return gold to Venezuela just to keep, some sense of cash flow. And now, of course, a real flashpoint with Iranian vessels on the way to Venezuela to deliver gasoline. This is a longstanding relationship that goes back to Chavez and Ahmadinejad, both rogue regimes trying to, kick dust in the face of Uncle Sam, finding common cause in their, radical political programs, but also their anti-American stances. And you also have a very significant deployment of U.S. military vessels in the Caribbean, long planned exercises on interdiction and other things. But this is a very, very potential flashpoint. The Venezuelan armed forces have announced that they were going to send naval ships to escort the Iranian carriers once they are within Venezuelan territorial waters. I mean, I think that this is just ripe for some kind of showdown, for some kind of, even electoral gambit by the Trump administration to show how we're keeping foreign powers from violating the Monroe Doctrine in our own hemisphere and keeping extra hemispheric powers out. So yes, all of these, rogue regimes have been critical to anti-democratic authoritarian regimes have been critical to Maduro's survival. And I think we're headed towards a potential very dangerous moment.
And lots of questions about how US policy should take that into account. The sanctioning of Rosneft in Venezuela recently was a sign that the US administration was thinking about how to curtail some of the activities of these undemocratic undemocratic governments. Anatoly, you posted on Twitter recently about Russia suing a newspaper for headlines associated with Venezuela. Talk a little bit about your perspective on what's going on with respect to Russia.
Sure. Hello. Yeah, I think now I'm in. Venezuela's relationship with Russia and its other allies, China, Cuba, Iran, are quite complex, and each one has its own arc, which went through many phases since Chavez. So I think it's quite problematic trying to reduce these complex relationships to with Maduro to hot and cold, which sometimes I think people try to assume. In the case of China, traditionally, Chavez's main ally, as Cynthia mentioned, they have not provided any new money. During the pandemic, there have been some shipments of medical supplies, of tests, etc. Some medical advisors have come in, but we have not seen really any new financing from China this time around that we've seen perhaps after the 2008 global financial crisis. And I know that although there have been attempts by Maduro to negotiate any new loans or credit lines, etc., it hasn't been successful. So I think it's hard to see now China as an active actor that is prepared to invest significantly in Maduro's survival. The case of Russia is more complex. I think what we've been seeing over the last few months is the separation between Russia's economic and political involvement. I think the political involvement is still very high. Russia still firmly, for Maduro in all global forum. It's still a major weapon of Maduro in international community, United Nations councils, multilateral organizations, UN, etc. But on the economic front, we have seen Russia stepping back. I think Rosneft's decision to pull out is significant. Obviously, these assets are still in the state of Russian states, but we're not seeing new ships coming in. We're not seeing new money Russian money being poured into into Venezuelan oil fields. So the actual hard economic help that Russia is providing Venezuela is decreasing. That's in some, that's being compensated to some degree with that strong political supports, international supports, military supports. According to Venezuela's own state media, Russian soldiers, for example, Russian military was helped search for members of that raid that came to Venezuela earlier this month. But support is still there. But I think it's changing. And then again, to kind of assume that Russia is just full front for Maduro unconditionally is a bit simplistic. Case of Iran. And this is relationship, that dates back very long time. In fact, seeing these tankers as some sort of, Russia, Iran's entry to Latin America, opening a new outpost in Latin America is again very simplistic. Remember that under Chavez, actually Iran's involvement in Venezuela was much, much higher. There were Iranian car plants, there were Iranian-made cement factories, Iranian workers were building homes here, all sorts of businesses that have now, gone completely bust and gone to nothing. Now we have a few tankers coming in, which serves both countries very well. Iran has loads of oil. Venezuela doesn't have any gasoline. But we have to put these relations in perspective. And as Venezuela's economic pie declines, as Venezuela sort of shrinks from a world overall, these relationships are assuming greater role, a greater sort of share of Venezuela's remaining relations, but they are less important in absolute terms.
Thanks, Anatoly. I'm going to throw one last question out on the table for anyone to take a chop at, and then I'll go to the questions, which, by the way, I see we're touching on a lot of the questions that are being asked, and time is flying. But let me get this one last one out because I think it's really important. And Cindy began to allude to it, and I think others have as well, the role of organized crime and illicit activity and sort of filling the gap. And Frank has often said this, that it's really important for us to know what the licit economy, right? So the licit commercial activity coming largely from PDVSA and other, legal activities are, and the amount of economy needed for the regime to stay in business. And that delta is really important, much of which is being filled, by the way, by illicit activity. And I think we know that. And I'll take the opportunity to plug the work of a good friend of ours, John Polga Hasimovich from the Naval Academy. He was my co-author on the Cuba-Venezuela report that Cindy referenced, and I know he's watching, so I want to make sure I plug his work because he's done some really fascinating work in this space as well, looking at the cartel de soles, right, and other types of institutional, issues or sort of the role organized crime is having in these institutions. And so just kind of touch on that for a few moments while I look at the questions and pull some out to throw on the table. And I saw, Harold, you were ready to go first. So over to you.
Thanks, Brian. You raise a really important point. I think the role of organized crime in Venezuela and particularly in the regime is critical to understanding the way forward. Part, as you say, is filling the hole between the licit economy and what the government needs to operate. I think taxing and managing that illicit economy is clearly part of what helps sustain the Maduro regime in power. I think a second part, this plays into the coup proofing that I alluded to before. I think one of the barriers for any military officer or group of military officers thinking about withdrawing support from the regime is the fact the regime actually has armed support that's not part of the armed forces. The colectivos, these criminal gangs that run major prisons, in other cases, the Pranes and their supporters, and of course, armed actors from Colombia that are operating out of Venezuela and are also involved in the illicit economy. These are all also actors that have a stake in things staying the way they are. So even if somebody wanted to change things within the military, this is another barrier to the transition. And finally, I think by providing access to the illicit economy and sort of tacitly sanctioning its participation, the Maduro regime essentially makes sure that the people in the armed forces, in the security forces, in the broader Chavista political movement that participate in the illicit economy, essentially their hands are all dirty now. So since their hands are dirty, they particularly have a stake in the regime continuing because they worry about being held accountable in the future following the transition, as Professor Gamboa pointed out earlier in the talk.
I think it's a great point as part of the coup proofing that you've talked about in the past, tying the survival of those military, military officers to the survival of the regime becomes one of those additional barriers to the military taking a step in the direction of transition the country. Laura, I think you hinted at me that you wanted to jump in. Yes? Okay, go for it.
So just to add that last part of accountability, I forgot to mention last time that one of the reasons why amnesty is very unlikely is because international courts won't allow it. It will be overturned. It's not a credible promise. What is an easier, I think illicit economies allow you for things that will be easier to negotiate. So we saw that with the FARC in Colombia, right? So a lot of what was negotiated was that crimes related to drug trafficking were going to be penalized at a lower level. And that's where most of the negotiation happened, while keeping crimes related to human rights held at a higher standard. Of course, that entails having a US government willing to forego sanctions via OFAC or extradition, for example. So it entails a lot of coordination, but I think I don't have a good idea on how to fix the stream of revenue, but I think illicit activities do allow for some kind of space to negotiate transitional justice in a way that won't be enraging for people who have been victims of human rights abuses. So it might give some margin there.
Thanks, Laura. Anatoly, anything you want to add in this context, or Cindy? And maybe I think Laura touched on it, the role of terrorist organizations or insurgencies that are sitting on the border, like ELN, right? Remnants of the FARC that are still operating on the Venezuelan side. Anything you want to add there, and then I'll bring in some questions from the audience.
I can add something, Brian. I mean, there are lots of reports from, the International Crisis Group, from others that talk about the fact that the ELN basically controls illegal gold mining in Venezuela. It's a source of revenue for its own insurgency. It's among the many reasons that the Colombian government is so intensely interested in the removal, transition, from the Maduro regime to a democratic regime, because they are actively harboring an insurgent terrorist group that continues to stage attacks within Colombia and along the border. There are also, dissident FARC elements that have, free reign to operate and to train and to do other kinds of things within Venezuelan territory. And you mentioned along the border too, where a lot of the migration routes now exist outside of the official crossing points, which are, of course, closed because the border is closed. And the illegal groups extort, they, make life miserable. There's human trafficking, and all kinds of other activities that endanger the lives of Venezuelans trying to flee. So there's a very poisonous role that Colombian insurgent groups are playing, within these illegal economies, and as you say, are a factor that have to be taken into account.
Thanks, Cindy. Anatoly, you want to add something?
Yeah, I think it's important to keep in mind, as we discussed with vets, the world is changing as we speak, and Venezuela is changing as we speak. There are, tremendous amounts of sort of unprecedented events happening in the country. The oil industry is still the biggest source of revenue for the government, is undergoing tremendous changes. The pandemic is just really, I think, arriving in force into the country. So a lot of things in flux, so in all these actors and their incentives and the conditions that we're discussing, they'll still be present, but I think the new equilibrium we may emerge from in the next few months might be quite different. So it's important to keep in mind the larger picture and just the tremendous flux that we are finding ourselves in.
Thanks, Anatoly. And I've seen, going back to sort of the illicit economy, I've seen some estimates as I guess probably the only estimates I've seen are about 14, 15 billion coming in the form of illicit activity. So there's obviously no real easy way to grab that kind of number, but has somebody seen anything else? Cindy, you have?
Sure. We held an event on Venezuela's illegal economies and their role in the economic life of the country. And Asdrubal Oliveros of Ecoanalítica, a consulting firm within Venezuela, estimated that about a third of revenues now are coming from various aspects of illicit economies, and that one of the sort of pernicious effects of the sanctions was to increase the importance of the illegal economies in the overall economic revenue and economic life of the country, which is not at all to say that sanctions are the cause of this, but just that they have changed its relative importance.
And that would also mean that a really important factor in sort of any type of approach to change in Venezuela is attacking that illicit economy. But we also have to understand that part of that illicit economy is also enabling many Venezuelans to get by, especially in some, sort of the more ambiguous spaces like gasoline smuggling, et cetera. Let me go over to the questions. We have 50 questions that we probably will not be able to get to. We could spend the entire week just talking about Venezuela. There's no doubt about it. I think some of them we've already answered to some degree, so I'm going to try to pick a few that I don't think we've really been clear on. And one is very direct, and I'll throw it to Laura or Harold. So our good friend Gabe Marcella asked the question as to whether or not there are any professionals left in the military institution, right? So is the Venezuelan military still a trusted professional institution? Can it be politically trusted to inherit the country if they were to step in and seize power?
So I think that's an excellent question, and I appreciate Gabe for posing it. And my guess is there's a mix. There's probably people who still join the military because they wanted to serve their country, or they wanted to drive ships or fly planes or drive tanks, and the typical motivations that I think would prompt anybody to join the armed forces, especially at junior level. I think that's complicated by the level of ideologization of the military. In some ways, barring the ideological comparison, which I do not intend, it reminds me a little bit of Spain after the death of Franco, where you had this very large military, poorly trained, over-officered, underfunded, involved in all kinds of political activities, too many generals and admirals, and that frankly, that Spain's new democracy had to spend some time, including with the assistance of NATO, in sort of re-professionalizing that armed force. But part of what the bargain that was struck between the new democratic regime and some ambitious and professional young officers was coming out the other side of the transition and consolidation of democracy would be this professional military where you'd be appropriately compensated, where you'd have career opportunities, where you'd have education and training, you'd have the opportunity to get ahead on your own merits without having to deal with the ideology of the regime. And even though the ideological context is, of course, 180 degrees opposite between Chavismo and Franquismo, the problem of what to do with a military that's bloated, ideologized, in many ways underfunded, and has deviated from its professional functions is similar. And I think that is going to have to be the bargain. I mean, this is what I mean about the opposition offering a credible vision for the future of the military. It has to be a vision that's different from the one of involved in organized crime, repression, human rights abuses, but is attractive to that sort of, hopefully, a younger generation of officers that really do just want to be, they want to run their infantry companies, they want to drive tanks, they want to fly planes, they want to serve their country. So I think there may be a path there. Of course, I don't have insider information that would allow me to decide what percentage of which kind of officer is still in the Venezuelan military.
Thanks. It's a great answer. I'm going to throw a question out, maybe Cindy, because she kind of hinted on this in her opening remarks, but what might the role be of sort of faith-based community, churches, maybe expand that to civil society? What role can they play in the humanitarian response? And there was a second question that sort of hinted on that. How can we expect, a totalitarian regime? How can we expect Maduro to accept aid, for the Venezuelan people? So kind of fusing those together a little bit. Can you take a swing at those? And if anybody else wants, just let me know.
Sure. I would get sort of beyond my comfort zone for sure, and beyond my range of expertise if I claim to know a lot about the activities of faith-based organizations within Venezuela. But there are certainly very prominent faith-based organizations like Caritas, connected, based in Rome, connected with the Catholic Church, that have played absolutely extraordinary and heroic roles in constantly trying to both document and deliver assistance on a need basis. It's very difficult for civil society organizations to operate. They don't have sources of funding. Their ability to get funding from abroad is extremely difficult, if not impossible in many cases. The government, makes that very impossible. But yet there is still a very active, I would not say thriving, but certainly a very active, civil society in Venezuela, working on humanitarian issues, working on electoral issues, working on a range of things, medical associations that have not been wiped out. And I don't think that we can count on the Maduro regime to, make their lives easier, but I think there are ways to try to depoliticize the issue of humanitarian assistance. Both the government and the opposition, I think, have erred, heavily on the side of politicization. You only need to remember, the gathering at the Colombian-Venezuelan border, rock concerts, all this other stuff about, trying to deliver aid with Juan Guaido marching in, as the savior of the Venezuelan people and their needs. I mean, this is not a way, as much as we would want to support, the massive delivery of humanitarian assistance, this is not the way, to approach it. And I think that, respect for neutrality and the ability of people to work with all sides is critical. And a lot of humanitarian organizations, civil society organizations came together some weeks ago before this failed invasion has really set back the clock in so many ways, calling on for basically a humanitarian agreement that would allow for the delivery of international assistance. And Juan Guaido and the opposition also had a proposal for a transitional government that would be able to receive humanitarian aid. And a lot of this has just now fallen on deaf ears as this failed, almost suicidal military incursion has been handed to Maduro on a silver platter, giving him all kinds of talking points about these foreign plots to destabilize, his regime and overthrow him and whatever. So it's a very difficult situation, but civil society is still there, and we should all try to look for ways to give greater breathing space, and enforce, principles of neutrality.
Thanks, Cindy. There's a question for Anatoly. The Maduro government seems to relish the lockdown. At the same time, the lockdown may be undermining the government to a degree. Do you think that the Maduro regime will extend the lockdown, lift it, or keep it, but let it crumble? What are your thoughts on that?
Thanks, Brian. Maduro is very good at making the best of a bad hand. By best, I mean best for him. And I think, coronavirus, especially, the early phases of it, the pandemic just kind of came to global view in January, February. He saw it as an opportunity to boost his legitimacy, as an opportunity to discredit the opposition, basically to show who's the boss in a country, and perhaps even to loosen that economic and political isolation around the world by giving incentives to country to loosen sanctions, to boost cooperation, boost humanitarian aid, etc. But hasn't quite played out to a degree that he wanted. The gasoline shortages have been much, I think, deeper and more severe than anyone has expected, including the government. So right now, I think it's fair to say that lockdown serves as a means to both minimize transportation or need for transportation around the country, and at the same time minimize the ability to protest lack of public services such as gasoline around the country. So lockdown does serve a great political purpose at the time, but there's tension there, because you can also see that the government has been very reluctant to enforce strongly lockdown, particularly in popular areas, out of fear of stoking social discontent, out of provoking people that are already under great strain. And you can see it around Caracas. I could leave the house now and there'll be shops open. As I said, there'll be cars everywhere in the streets, people walking, and the lockdown is still on. Lockdown is technically on, and as I said, the virus is just beginning to spread. So I think finding that balance between keeping lockdown compliance to a certain degree, without being too severe, too harsh, and provoking an explosion of social discontent is a very delicate, I think, line the government will be playing over the last few weeks. In the state of Zulia, on the Colombian border, yesterday the governor announced quite a draconian lockdown, that no one can be allowed on the streets after 2 p.m. There were photos of police rounding up pretty much everyone they could find, Peru-style measures, and we're just going to have to see if it's going to be implemented in other states. I'm guessing it is, and then it will be relaxed again, then it will be loosened. Because at the end of the day, first of all, this virus is probably not going away for a while, and also the gasoline shortages are not going away anytime soon. There's no way for Maduro to really solve the supply issue in a significant way. So this is, I think that's kind of going to be the main kind of political act, the main balancing act of loosening and tightening social controls for the next few months.
It's a great point. And I know when we talked a few months ago, you indicated that as we turned into 2020, you were starting to see the reemergence of street vendors and sort of some of that economic activity, but it dried up almost immediately as soon as lockdown came around, and that pushed sort of back into.
That's right. Yeah, but the lockdown. I'm sorry, a point I did mention very briefly. The lockdown forced Maduro to sacrifice this sort of so-called Chinese opening, the sort of so-called liberalization of the economy that did really well for him, but allowed him to bring back, if not economic prosperity, but at least to flatten the curve of collapse a bit. That had to be sacrificed, but that's over now. That was a casualty of the current situation. But again, he's not Maduro. He's not trying to make things great. He's just trying to make the best of a progressively deteriorating situation.
Yeah, and trying to survive, and some of these are pressure release valves, right? In order to to try to stymie some of the social unrest and mobilization. There's another, thanks Anatoly. There's another question that I want to throw out and just indicate if you want to take a shot at it. It's a really important question about what other Latin American countries can do in the process of aiding Venezuela back in the direction of democracy. Knowing that, by the way, there is probably no immediate way back to democracy. That the unpurging and redeveloping of institutions that are vital to flourishing democracies is a generation or more away. And so there's a process here. But what can other Latin American countries do? Who wants to take a shot at that one?
Plenty to say. I don't know, but
all right, Anatoly, go first since you still got the mic on, and then we'll go to Laura.
Yeah, I still have. Yeah, very briefly, I'd say that there's plenty they can do. They're natural allies. They're natural, sort of supporters of Venezuela's transition to a democracy. the region has been quite united in condemning Maduro, in joining American, recognizing Guaido through so-called Lima Group of calling for political transition in Venezuela, and that looked like a benefit early on. By now, it's beginning to look more like a liability. The closeness of Latin American regimes to Guaido and the way they kind of put all their eggs in one basket there. And as Guaido's star fades, that there's no real substitution there. Of course, all these countries are facing major problems themselves right now, with the pandemic, tremendous economic collapse, especially the countries that's hosting largest Venezuelan populations. We're talking about Colombia, Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, etc. So it's very difficult for this country to expect to I suppose, to significantly contribute economically to Venezuela right now, as they have so much to deal at home. It has been pointed out by multilateral organizations that there's been very little donating to humanitarian projects in Venezuela by its neighboring country, and that's very different, for example, from the Arab world, where relief efforts in Syria and Yemen are primarily funded by, or to a large extent funded by other Arab countries. Of course, you have a lot of rich Arab countries, which is not quite the case in Latin America. But there is a sense that they could be doing more to if not lead to a transition, to at least try to ameliorate the suffering. But I think once this hot phase of the pandemic passes, I think there's obviously great scope for the region to regain that protagonism and to try to break this deadlock in political paralysis.
Thanks, Anatoly. Laura, did you want to add something?
So I'll start by what they shouldn't do, which is give credence to the warmongering type of discourse. I've seen that in particular, again, from Colombia. I've seen it from Brazil as well, and that makes sense. This idea of kind of not saying that they're going to allow an invasion, but kind of not denying it either. So I think a strong refusal to engage in any kind of armed solution is an important thing. I will also add that I think it's important to figure out mechanisms to deal with the refugee crisis. And that is key. I'm a little out of my comfort zone given the specifics about that, but I think we need to figure out a better, more coordinated way to deal with massive amounts of refugees, which I guess some of them are returning now across the border, because I think that's destabilizing for the region, but I also think because it's an important thing to do as neighbors. So those are the two things that I would add.
Cindy, sorry.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Brian. Just to add to a couple of points that have already been made, I guess I differ a little bit with Anatoly. The region at one point, when Juan Guaido emerged, was very united in backing him. But, I think that elections in Argentina, in Mexico, have really kind of broken what was a sort of coalition of Latin American democracies in favor of a transition. So the political message is a lot more diluted. Now, at some point, if there were a riper moment for a transition, that could be very helpful, because you want people that can be interlocutors, with the Maduro regime, but you don't see any evidence of that. And then also, to reinforce a point that Anatoly said, these are governments that are now not only dealing with these, catastrophic economic declines in the wake of the coronavirus, but even before that, we're facing, pretty intense protest movements in Ecuador and Colombia and Chile at the end of 2019. And so their ability to be other than internally focused, I think, is very much questionable. And then finally, on the question of a regional response to the refugee situation, I couldn't agree more. The resources have been a fraction of what they need to be. The needs that have been identified by these platforms established by the United Nations and the International Office of Migration, identifying the needs of all of the countries that are receiving Venezuelan refugees, including in the Caribbean, which has, a smaller number, but as a percentage of the overall population, it's of course much greater. But to assess these needs, and the international community has not really stepped up. The US government, USAID, is by far the largest contributor to the regional refugee response. The attitude in Europe may be beginning to change, but we'll see. In the wake of the coronavirus, they were starting, they had seen this mostly as an American problem. It's kind of, you break it, you fix it. And also, Western Hemisphere being seen as a traditional area where the United States is the major international power and influence. So I completely agree that there is a crying need. Several, maybe tens of thousands of refugees have returned because if they were working in the informal economy. There's absolutely no work. And I think they just feel like if they're gonna, suffer and be hungry and be on the streets, that they'd rather, be with their families. So there is a humanitarian corridor to allow for Venezuelans to go back into Venezuela, but it's, over time, the flow of Venezuelans out is going to continue. And to the degree that the borders are officially closed, it's going to continue on these informal crossing points, the trochas, which are controlled by illegal armed actors. And it's going to be a bigger and bigger mess.
Thanks, Cindy. There's a few questions in here, and I'm going to answer one as I ask it to Harold, because the second question is to Harold. Is really about, why shouldn't the United States totally isolate Venezuela? And I think the answer is because the United States can't totally isolate Venezuela for the reasons that we've laid out, especially the other actors that are playing important roles in keeping the regime going. And that's not just Cuba, Russia, China, but that's Iran, that's Turkey, that was India at one point. And so there are other countries that certainly have been a lifeline for the regime, making it very difficult for the United States to totally isolate the country from an economic perspective. And so that sort of, spins off a second question that was directed towards Harold is, how can the United States offer incentives to those external actors to abandon the regime? And how does the US break those or provide those incentives without seeming soft towards countries like Russia and China and Iran? So any thoughts on how the United States expands that, that sort of community of countries looking for change in Venezuela?
Thanks, Brian. I think that's a really important question. I think part of, as some of the other panelists alluded to, the issue of audiences and the issue of saving face, not appearing soft, are all important and very difficult to solve. And we also have to recall that it took, for example, in the case of Iran, it took a very long time to get Russia and China on board with sort of nearly universal sanctions on the Iranian regime to try to force it into agreement on its nuclear program under the JCPOA. So this is it takes a long time. It's a diplomatic slog. It requires working in a sort of non-adversarial fashion that, in fact, may not be possible anymore. I mean, I think what we have to remember is that Venezuela is now caught up in the return of great power rivalry. Yeah. And so as China, the US, and Russia compete around the world, Venezuela is just one more place where this is happening. So just as we see this happening in Syria or Libya or Southeast Asia, Venezuela is now part of this. So it's sort of hard to envision that kind of coalition of countries coming together to totally isolate Venezuela, because the US alone is not able to isolate Venezuela. It has land borders, as well, the sea borders that the U.S. can't entirely control on its own, and even if it tried to control, would bring it into dangerous confrontations with other powers that would not agree with the United States, such as Russia, China, and frankly would probably lose the support of a lot of partners and allies in Europe and Latin America. So from the point of view of any U.S. administration, I don't just mean the Trump administration, but any U.S. administration thinking about what's the cost to me of totally isolating Venezuela, in terms of damage to my diplomatic relationships and economic relationships around the world to the benefit. And I think any kind of cold calculation of that has led U.S. administration to think, even while I would find, regime, return to democracy in Venezuela desirable, I'd love to have accountability for people who've committed human rights abuses or engaged in criminal activity. But how do I balance that against all my other interests as a great power? And I think there is really what is sadly weighs against any of these sort of more extreme efforts to try to apply the full weight of U.S. power in the case of Venezuela.
That's a great point. Anybody else want to add to that? Okay, no, I'm not seeing any takers. Okay, there we go, Laura.
So I get a little concerned when I hear this discourse of what can the United States do, and I just want to emphasize that the United States can foster, they can work behind the scenes. They have done it in the past several times. But really, honestly, what needs to happen in Venezuela needs to come from within. The United States cannot just come down and hand out or fail to hand out. It's just not. It's not how it works. Which is the other reason why fully isolated Venezuela, even if it was possible, it's not going to work, because yes, you put Venezuela in a dire situation, and then what? You need causal mechanisms inside the country. You need somebody in the country to take advantage of that and push for something. And without that link, it won't do anything.
I think that's an excellent point, that in the end, this is a problem that will be solved and has to be solved by the Venezuelan people. Certainly there can be external support and infrastructure, but this is a problem that is solved by the Venezuelan people. And we hear that over and over. And in fact, some of the questions and comments that came up in the chat box had a lot to do with, our discussion centering not on Maduro, but on all of the other obstacles around Maduro. And I want to be clear that I think every one of us is saying that Maduro is the problem. And whether that's a problem in terms of governance or a problem in terms of the humanitarian crisis, Maduro is the problem. The question really is about how do you dislodge a regime that has no intentions of leaving? And therein lies the broader question about the complexity of all of the things around Maduro and how you move them in a direction sort of in harmony that leads to the effect that you're looking for, which is resolving the humanitarian crisis and restoring, or at least transitioning the country over time back to the democratic principles of the game. And so Harold wants to jump in there. Go for it.
Brian, I think that's an excellent point. Obviously, I think all of us understand that Maduro is at the crux of the problem we see in Venezuela today. But I think that people who focus on Maduro are ignoring the broader support structure, the incentive structure, those costs and benefits that Professor Gamboa talked about, the illicit economy that Dr. Arnson talked about, all the factors that Anatole Carmen talked about that sort of support the regime. It's not one person, it's a regime, it's a structure of individuals, institutions, rules, agreements that perpetuate themselves in time and have a benefit from remaining in power. And so I think for people who focus so narrowly on Maduro and think that, if he just left, then things would get better, really ignores the very deep institutional and structural factors that keep the current governing system in Venezuela in power.
And that's an excellent point, because we said the same thing with the departure of Chavez, and now it's the departure of Maduro, and next it could be the departure of somebody else. There are, there's no shortage of kleptocrats sitting in the regime that are ready to step in if Maduro is gone. And so that sort of begs in the question what the end state is. What's the goal? If the goal is simply removal of Maduro, that's not enough, to address the humanitarian crisis or, provide for conditions of the restoration of democracy. At the end of the day, that's not enough. It's a lot more complex than that. And I think Harold hits it. We're out of time. There was no way for me to get through all of the questions and comments. I couldn't even begin to touch the ones in social media. Orlando Perez is out there tweeting like crazy, so I highly recommend some of you going back and checking out what he has to say so we can respond to some of his thoughts. But I am just absolutely honored and delighted to be with such a tremendous intellectual trust on this panel. Famed journalist Anatoly Kurmanaev, of course, my intellectual mentors, Dr. Arnson and Dr. Trinkunas, and Dr. Gamboa, for the amazing work that she continues to do on democratic institutions and political regimes across the region. So with that, thank you all very much. And I will bring in Dr. Frank Mora to close us out.
Thank you, Brian. That was indeed fascinating. Wow. We could have gone on for a while. And I just to let people know, we had over 300 participants. We had like 70 questions. This was a superb panel. We need to get this band together again in the near future. Thank you again. So for those of you who are participating, the conference continues. We are back tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock. We have a panel on the security situation in Central America and the Caribbean. And we have as good a panel members as we've had today. So please join us. It's the last day of the 5-day conference on hemispheric security in the Americas. So with that, have a great day. Once again, panelists, thank you so much for joining us. And everyone else, see you tomorrow. Thank you.